Thank you very much, Speaker. And a definition of the Labor Party could be well and truly added onto that as corruption, crooks, crime, theft. The list goes on, and it doesn't even have to be us saying it. You can go on about what we're saying, but you've got to listen to the reports from those people that you've signed contracts to put in place to hold integrity here in this state. The Ombudsman. The Ombudsman on more than one occasion has to come out and slam this government for behaviours that are inappropriate, that wouldn't be accepted in our community. And listening to the contribution then from the member from Mordialloc, it highlights the one thing. When he said, stop talking about 2014, it is the evidence of something I've been saying for a long time. The standard you walk past is the one you accept. And it's continuous, where the Labor Party walk past this and start to see the corruption and culture is now spreading, not just within themselves, but throughout the entire public sector. And how does it get into the public sector? It gets there because Daniel Andrews has appointed 90 of his own staff from his office into senior roles in the public sector. That's how you spread corruption. That's how you keep control. That is how you ensure that you can control everything that is happening throughout the entire system. And a lot of it would be people who wouldn't, shouldn't and couldn't get a role like that ever, but then have to do what they are told by the Premier to ensure they can keep the paycheck that is well and truly above their pay grade. The Ombudsman slams the Premier's response into the damning IBAC report when Daniel Andrews came out and said that it was an educational report with Daintree, Operation Daintree. They came out and stated clearly that this was not a report into an education report. It was a damning report into the government in how they had dealt with the Health Workers Union and giving funds to them before the last election. At the same time, the Health Workers Union were making donations, sizable donations, to the Labor Party. And the question has to be, was that money from part of the grants that went through? There's a question that fairly should be raised, investigated, and found out what was the level of corruption that was involved in those deals. Now, again, the member from Mordialloc I know mentioned, and I know he's not going to like this part, when we go back to 2014, we talk about the red shirts rorts. And the red shirts rorts I will continue to talk about because it absolutely makes me irate that anyone, including Victoria Police, could turn around and say someone signing a document which allows a person to get paid to not do their job is not obtain financial advantage by deception. To prove obtaining financial advantage by deception, you've got to prove the identity of the person, you've got to prove they dishonestly appropriated. That's pretty obvious. They're signing documents. Some of them signed it without even knowing who they were signing for. They've signed those documents. There has to be a financial exchange, and someone has ended up with a financial advantage at the time. Now, this went through the process of the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman referred it on to IBAC. It went through the Victoria Police. And at the time, no Labor person, other than the Premier who said they were going to all comply with this, said that they would comply with the full investigation. The Premier of this state said everyone should comply with that investigation, and no one did. It made it more and more difficult, and they intervened and stopped that investigation going through. Then, when it came out later on, and you had more whistleblowers come out, and before the 22 state election, you had a whistleblower come out with more evidence saying people needed to be interviewed, people needed to make sure that they were put on record. There was go through emails, look at some of the police data, look at some of the issues of who was investigating and how it happened. And at the time, it is on record that when it was decided by the Office of Public Prosecutions to not proceed, who was the Solicitor for Public Prosecutions at the time? John Cain Jr. John Cain Jr. was there. It also went through the Victoria Police, and Shane Patton came out and went on record and said that there would be no further investigation from Victoria Police. It had been referred to the North West Metro Region Assistant Commissioner, who has made a recommendation to not proceed with any more charges and not proceed with investigation. Now, it won't surprise people, but it worries me because I'm a former police officer and I'd hate the fact there'd be corruption in the Victoria Police. But the commissioner at the time, the assistant commissioner who recommended that was Brett Curran. Brett Curran used to be the Chief of Staff in the Premier's office and is now in Victoria Police. I cannot fathom that he did not step back from this at all and say, I will have nothing to do with it. I cannot understand how the Victoria Police can continue to come out and state that there is nothing to see here. A constable walking out of the academy tomorrow, I guarantee, could look at this investigation, look at the evidence, and people would be charged. There is nothing surer in my life. A constable who's just graduating could find this evidence and ensure someone is charged. But yet in Victoria, we just walk past it. And we can't continue to walk past this kind of behaviour. It's just simply not on. As I've said continuously, and I'll say it again, we can't continue to misuse people's money, Victorians' money, and expect them to believe that there's no corruption happening in here in this state. In the time I've been here, I'd have to say, one of the worst lots of corruption I have seen in this place, again washed under the carpet, and the penalty now is, if anyone in this place makes a mistake on any of your finances now, there's a 25% penalty. Why? Because we had a Speaker and a Deputy Speaker whose corrupt behaviour stole money from this government, stole money from the taxpayers' people. $113,000 to Don Nardella, as the Deputy Speaker at the time, who was claiming to live in a caravan down in Ocean Grove. Claiming to live in a caravan. He wasn't representing an area down there, he was representing Melton. So not only was he admitting he'd prefer to live in a caravan in Ocean Grove than live with the people he was supposed to represent, he was charging them an extra $113,000 on top of his wage for the privilege that they didn't have to have him there. And he wasn't even living in Melton. This man did everything he could. He got every rule in the book and broke them. And what was the outcome? What was the answer from the Premier? Apart from defending him for a long period of time, when he could eventually no longer defend the indefensible, he sent him up to the back bench and he said, "You're a naughty boy, and we're going to make you pay some of it back. But you don't have to pay it all back straight away. We don't want to send you a broker or anything. We'll let you pay it off over time with zero penalty." Zero penalty. How can you reward corrupt behaviour like that and expect people to think there's not corruption in this state? The Speaker took nearly $40,000. The corruption in that role, the person who's supposed to uphold the rights of this place, uphold the standards in this place, was the one that was breaching him and stole nearly $40,000. And you know what frustrates me? It's after, when he turns around and he says, "I have a mental health issue." You stole money. Your problem was you got caught. The problem wasn't before. The problem was the day you got caught. And no person in Labor, Liberal, Nats, Independents, Greens can defend the behaviour of those two. No one. Yet they've both left this place quite happy with their lifetime pensions. They're still getting fully supported. They are still getting paid as much as probably us being in here because they were in executive roles. Where is the fairness for all Victorians that the two people that stole $150,000+, the corrupt behaviour of Labor speakers and deputy speakers, aren't held to account? It simply doesn't make sense. And that's why Operation Daintree is so damning. And it's not an educational report. Operation Daintree highlights issues, major issues within the government. It highlights them. And you're calling it an education report because it's the easiest way to push under the carpet the issues that you're continuing to have within government. Continuing these issues come up, the easiest way to solve it is deny it, tell the community we're going to do the right thing, and then we'll bring in new penalties in the future. And then the newest one, grey corruption. What a crock. It's corruption or it's not. There's no grey corruption. It's corruption or it's not. And Daintree highlights the fact of this so-called grey corruption. I think by admission that means there is corruption. And again, why isn't this being investigated? Why is this not now going? What's IBAC? Why isn't IBAC following through on this? Why aren't the Victoria Police looking at some of the corruption allegations that are in there? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. I look out into the community and I hear some, and I know, we're not silly, there's some conspiracy theorists out there that will come up with some wonderful things about have or haven't happened in government. But there's got to be a time that eventually the community turn around and go, why aren't these people being investigated? I'll also go back to another one which I know, the Operation Richmond. Operation Richmond is an investigation into dealings between the Victorian Government, the Premier's office, Peter Marshall and United Firefighters Union management. And I think it's really important that we do highlight it. It's United Firefighters Union management, because I think there's a lot of United Firefighters Union members who don't trust Peter Marshall. I think there's plenty of them because they manage to speak to us a fair bit now. It is a huge concern that the Victorian Government signed an EBA and signed away powers that they should never hand over to a union, and no one knows what is the impact of that long term. Peter Marshall gets what he wants when he wants. And when people say about what have they got over him, what is it? I don't believe Peter Marshall's got anything over Daniel Andrews. I actually think Daniel Andrews enjoys giving away to some of his mates the power that they can then use that to their best of ability to win him elections in the future.
Please refer to members by the correct term rather than their names.
The Premier. So the Premier enjoys giving away to his mates the powers that were gifted to him from the Victorian people, so they can use that for evil rather than good. And Peter Marshall, over his time, the union management over time, I don't think anyone could argue, have achieved some amazing outcomes in relation to safety. I don't think anyone could argue with that. But when they start putting in place things like consult and agree and removing the power from management of the fire services, what do we end up with? We end up with a fire chief who came over here from United Kingdom, who was absolutely outstanding in his role. Peter Marshall didn't want him here, so he made sure that when they changed from CFA MFB through to FRV, that he could no longer apply for a role that in writing he already had he was going to be here for 5 years. So the minister had said, here's your contract, 5 years. At one point in time, you're going to change to FRV. We're going to make sure that you're all good. No dramas at all. Peter Marshall says, no, don't like that. Consult and agree clause. We won't be sticking with that one. Please move him on. And we lost a genuinely good fire chief. Then we got Ken Block. Now, I don't know Ken Block personally, but let me assure you, Ken Block was not here for the fire services. He was here because he was Peter Marshall's mate. He was pushed to get into that role, and he came across from Canada. He's now gone home, and he's obviously resigned or retired, and I know he's got family issues with his wife over there, so I'm going to be a fair bit nice on it. But whilst he was here, let me assure you, Ken Block did nothing to stop the power that was there from Peter Marshall. He got out of the way to allow Peter Marshall to do what he wanted, and he hated it. He hated it. He hated the fact that he came here to run a fire service, and he couldn't do it because he had no power. He had no authority. And that's what happens when you end up with corruption in the government services. And it starts from the top. You've got a Premier who simply doesn't care. He is so power-driven. And I'll go back to the member for Mordialloc. I can't believe defended him. He's so power-driven, he did everything he could to destroy one faction of the Labor Party so he could have absolute power in the Labor Party. Absolute power. And with absolute power, he is now not just destroying the Labor Party, the impact is across our entire state. And the costs are going to be horrendous. We see it in big build projects, cost blowouts. We see some of the prices it's now costing to run the fire services. We're seeing how much it costs. It costs $5,000 a day to keep a kid in a youth detention. Why? Because the costs are out of control, because this government doesn't know how to control it, because they are now absolutely out of control with corruption they've started at the top. Daniel Andrews, I don't care if he resigns, to be honest. Really couldn't care less. But what he does need to do is come out and admit that his corruption is the reason that Victoria is heading down the path it's heading. And it's not a good goal at the end that he's aiming for. We need to make sure these investigations take place and the only outcome will be a positive one when someone on that side is eventually charged.